It was one of those sticky summer evenings where the air felt heavy, and every step seemed to take a little extra effort. The kind of evening where even the cicadas sounded tired. A 60-year-old woman, who everyone in her neighborhood knew as Evelyn, was walking home after finishing her weekly grocery shopping. She had lived in this small town called Crestwood for over 30 years. To her, it wasn't just a place on the map, it was home. It was where she raised her kids, taught generations of students at the local school, and built friendships that lasted decades. Evelyn carried 2 bags of groceries, one in each hand, as she made her way across an almost empty parking lot near her apartment building. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but there was still enough light to see clearly. She hummed softly to herself, thinking about how nice it would be to sit down with a cup of tea once she got inside. Life was simple for Evelyn these days, and she liked it that way. She didn't ask for much, just peace, respect, and a chance to enjoy the life she had worked so hard to build. But then, out of nowhere, things changed. The sound of tires screeching against asphalt broke the calm. Evelyn turned her head slightly and saw a police cruiser pulling up behind her. At first, she thought maybe something was wrong. Perhaps someone nearby needed help, or maybe there had been an accident. But when the car came to a stop, she realized it wasn't here for anything else, it was here for her. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the uniform of a police officer. His name tag read, Reynolds. Evelyn recognized him vaguely from around town. Over the years, she'd heard whispers about him, that he wasn't always polite, especially not to people who looked like her. Still, she told herself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he just wanted to check if she was okay. "Ma'am, stop right there," Reynolds barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Evelyn froze mid-step. Her heart started to race, though she tried to stay calm. "Is everything all right, officer?" she asked politely, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "What are you doing out here?" Reynolds demanded, ignoring her question. His tone was harsh, accusatory. "I'm just coming back from the store," Evelyn replied, holding up her grocery bags as if they were proof of her innocence. "I live in the building over there." She pointed toward her apartment complex, which was only a short walk away. But Reynolds didn't seem satisfied. Instead of softening, his expression grew darker. "You sure about that? Don't lie to me." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by his words. Why would she lie? What reason could she possibly have? She repeated herself, trying to keep her voice even. "Yes, sir. I promise. I'm just heading home." For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them stretched thin, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then, without warning, Reynolds reached for his gun. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it out of its holster and pointed it directly at Evelyn's chest. Time seemed to freeze. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had she done something wrong? Was this really happening? All she could think about was how absurd it all felt. She was a grandmother, a retired teacher, someone who spent most of her time baking cookies or reading books. And now here she was, staring down the barrel of a gun, for no reason she could understand. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Something inside her refused to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she stood her ground, looking him straight in the eye. "Sir," she said firmly, "you're making a mistake." Across the street, unnoticed by either of them, a young man sat on a bench, scrolling through his phone. When he heard the commotion, he glanced up curiously. Seeing the scene unfold before him, his eyes widened in disbelief. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and began recording. Little did anyone know that video would soon change everything. As the seconds ticked by, Reynolds finally lowered his weapon, though his expression remained cold. "Get going," he muttered gruffly. "And don't let me catch you doing anything suspicious again." Evelyn nodded silently, too shaken to respond. She walked away as quickly as her legs would carry her, clutching her grocery bags tightly. Every step felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely unlock the door. Once inside, she set the bags down and sank into a chair, trying to process what had just happened. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away angrily. She wasn't going to let this break her. Not today. Not ever. What Evelyn didn't know yet was that this incident was far from over. In fact, it was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would ripple through her community, spark outrage across the nation, and ultimately lead to consequences no one could have predicted. The next morning, Evelyn woke up feeling like she hadn't slept at all. Her mind kept replaying the events of the previous night, the sound of the car pulling up behind her, the officer's harsh voice, and, most vividly, the sight of that gun, pointed straight at her chest. It was hard to shake off the fear and confusion. She had always thought of herself as someone who understood people, who believed in giving others the benefit of the doubt, but last night had shaken her faith in humanity. Evelyn decided to call her daughter first thing in the morning. She needed to talk to someone, anyone, about what had happened. Her daughter listened quietly on the other end of the line, gasping when Evelyn described how the officer had pulled out his weapon. "Mom, you have to report this," her daughter insisted. "This isn't right. You can't let him get away with treating you like that." But Evelyn hesitated. Reporting it meant going through official channels, dealing with paperwork, interviews, and possibly facing backlash. She didn't want to become a target or put herself in more danger. Still, deep down, she knew her daughter was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what was fair, not just for herself, but for everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation one day. Later that afternoon, while sitting in her living room trying to distract herself with a book, Evelyn heard her phone buzz. It was a notification from social media, a platform she rarely used. Curious, she picked up her phone and opened the app. What she saw stopped her cold. A video had surfaced online. Someone across the street had recorded the entire encounter between her and the officer. The clip showed everything, the way he had approached her aggressively the moment he drew his gun, and how she stood firm despite the fear written all over her face. The video already had thousands of views, and comments were pouring in faster than Evelyn could read them. People were outraged. They called the officer's actions unacceptable, criminal even. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly by law enforcement. Others praised Evelyn for staying calm under such intense pressure. Hashtags like "Sayang Justice for her" and "Enough Eyes Enough" began trending on social media platforms. Strangers from all over the country were rallying around her, demanding accountability. At first, Evelyn felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. All her life, she had preferred to stay in the background, quietly doing her part without seeking attention. But now here she was, thrust into the center of a national conversation about police brutality and racial injustice. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. But strangely, she also felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of this nightmare. As the hours passed, news outlets picked up the story. Reporters started calling her phone nonstop, asking for interviews. Neighbors knocked on her door, offering support and expressing their shock at what had happened. Even local leaders reached out, promising to look into the matter. For the first time in days, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that change might actually be possible, but not everyone reacted positively. There were skeptics too, people defending the officer, saying he was just doing his job. Some accused Evelyn of exaggerating the situation, or suggested she must have done something to provoke him. These comments stung, but they didn't surprise her. She had lived long enough to know that not everyone would see things her way. What mattered was that enough people did care, and those voices were growing louder by the minute. Meanwhile, the officer involved, Reynolds, was starting to feel the heat. At first, he brushed off the incident, convinced it would blow over quickly. After all, nothing like this had ever stuck to him before. But as the video spread and public outrage grew, cracks began to show in his confidence. His colleagues at the police station avoided eye contact with him during shifts. Some whispered behind his back, distancing themselves from the controversy. Others defended him half-heartedly, though it was clear they were uncomfortable being associated with him. Things got worse for Reynolds when old complaints against him resurfaced. People came forward with stories of past encounters where he had allegedly used excessive force or made racially charged remarks. One woman recounted how he had stopped her son for no reason other time than because of the color of his skin. Another man described being handcuffed and thrown to the ground after a minor traffic violation. These accounts painted a troubling picture of a pattern, one that many felt should have been addressed years ago. Internally, the police department scrambled to contain the fallout. An investigation was launched to review Reynolds' conduct, both in this specific incident and in general. Higher-ups issued statements promising transparency and accountability, though few believed them entirely. Trust between the community and law enforcement had been shattered, and piecing it back together wouldn't be easy. For Evelyn, watching the chaos unfold from her living room was surreal. On one hand, she was grateful for the support pouring in from strangers and neighbors alike. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel angry, not just at Reynolds, but at the system that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. How many others had suffered silently because they didn't have a camera rolling? How many injustices had gone unnoticed? Despite the whirlwind surrounding her, Evelyn refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she focused on what she could control. With encouragement from her family and friends, she agreed to give an interview to a trusted journalist. Sitting in front of the camera, she spoke calmly but firmly about her experience. She talked about the fear she had felt that night, the frustration of being treated as guilty until proven innocent, and her determination to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better. Her words resonated deeply with viewers. Many said her courage inspired them to speak out about their own experiences. Others pledged to join protests planned in her honor. Slowly but surely, Evelyn realized that her voice carried power, a power she never imagined she possessed. And, so as the days turned into weeks, the movement gained momentum. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs and chanting slogans. Local activists organized town hall meetings to discuss reforms. Lawyers specializing in civil rights offered their services pro bono, vowing to hold the department accountable. What started as a single act of aggression against an elderly woman had sparked a wave of activism that showed no signs of slowing down. Evelyn knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Hopeful that her story might inspire others to stand up and demand change. Hopeful that justice, however delayed, could still be served. And hopeful that, together, they could build a future where no one had to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. The momentum surrounding Evelyn's case continued to grow, and the small town of Crestwood found itself at the center of a national conversation. What started as a single incident had snowballed into something much bigger, a movement demanding accountability, transparency, and justice. For Evelyn, the days following the viral video were a whirlwind of emotions. She felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also empowered by the support she received from people she didn't even know. Evelyn decided to take legal action. With the help of her family and trusted advisors, she filed a formal complaint against the officer involved and the police department as a whole. The complaint accused them of racial profiling, excessive use of force, and failing to address repeated misconduct by certain officers. It was a bold move, one that required courage and resolve. Evelyn knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Her decision to pursue legal action caught the attention of civil rights organizations across the country. They reached out to offer assistance, providing lawyers who specialized in cases involving police misconduct. These attorneys weren't just skilled professionals. They were passionate advocates committed to fighting for justice. One lawyer in particular stood out to Evelyn. He was calm, patient, and genuinely listened when she spoke. "You're not alone in this," he told her during their first meeting. "We'll stand with you every step of the way." As preparations for the lawsuit began, shocking details about the officer's past started to emerge. Records showed multiple unresolved complaints against him, dating back years. Some alleged verbal abuse, while others described instances of physical intimidation or unnecessary force. In each case, the complaints had either been dismissed due to lack of evidence or quietly swept under the rug. This pattern painted a clear picture. The system had failed time and again to hold him accountable. One story stood out among the rest. A young man came forward sharing how he had been stopped late at night for no apparent reason. According to him, the officer had shouted insults, slammed him against his car, and searched him without cause. The young man had been too scared to file a report at the time, fearing retaliation. But now, seeing Evelyn's bravery, he felt emboldened to speak up. His testimony added weight to the growing body of evidence against the officer. Meanwhile, tensions within the police department reached an all-time high. Officers were divided. Some privately admitted they feared speaking out, worried about facing consequences themselves if they criticized their colleague. Others defended the accused officer, arguing that his actions were justified and that outsiders didn't understand the pressures of the job. These divisions highlighted deeper issues within the department, including a culture of silence and complicity that allowed bad behavior to go unchecked. The district attorney announced criminal charges against the officer, citing assault with a deadly weapon and violation of civil rights. News of the charges spread quickly, drawing mixed reactions from the public. Many celebrated the decision as a long overdue step toward accountability. Protesters outside the police station cheered, holding signs that read, "Justice delayed, is justice denied, and no more excuses." Others remained skeptical, pointing out that charges alone weren't enough. They wanted real change, starting with reforms within the department. For Evelyn, the announcement brought a mix of relief and anxiety. On one hand, she was glad to see the legal process moving forward. On the other hand, she knew the fight was far from over. Trials could drag on for months, even years, and there was always the possibility of acquittal. Still, she refused to let doubt creep in. She reminded herself why she had chosen to speak out, to shine a light on injustice and inspire others to do the same. As the weeks passed, Evelyn became more involved in the growing movement. She attended rallies, spoke at community meetings, and met with local leaders to discuss potential reforms. Her presence inspired people, young and old alike. They saw her as a symbol of resilience, proof that standing up for what's right can make a difference. At one rally, a teenage girl approached Evelyn after her speech, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," the girl said softly. "I've been scared to speak up about what happened to me, but hearing your story makes me feel like I'm not alone." Evelyn hugged the girl tightly, feeling a lump rise in her own throat. Moments like these reminded her why she couldn't give up. Every tear shed, every voice raised, and every person inspired fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. Behind the scenes, lawyers worked tirelessly to build a strong case. They gathered witness testimonies, reviewed surveillance footage, and consulted experts on police conduct. Each piece of evidence strengthened their argument, painting a damning portrait of an officer who had abused his power repeatedly without facing consequences. Meanwhile, the defense team scrambled to counter the allegations, claiming the officer had acted within protocol and suggesting that the public outcry was based on misinformation. The media coverage intensified as the trial date approached. News outlets aired interviews with both sides, sparking heated debates online and offline. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting Evelyn and calling for systemic reform. Supporters organized fundraisers to cover legal expenses, raising thousands of dollars in just a few days. Even celebrities joined the conversation, amplifying Evelyn's message to millions of followers. In Crestwood, the impact of Evelyn's case was undeniable. Residents who had once felt powerless began speaking out about their own experiences with law enforcement. Community groups formed to advocate for changes, such as implementing mandatory de-escalation training for officers and establishing independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Local businesses displayed signs showing solidarity with the movement, and schools hosted discussions about racism and accountability. Despite the progress, Evelyn knew the journey ahead would be challenging. She understood that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It would require persistence, patience, and unwavering commitment. But she also believed that every small victory mattered. Whether it was convincing one person to listen, inspiring another to act, or simply reminding someone that they weren't alone, each step forward brought her closer to the future she envisioned. As she prepared for the trial, Evelyn reflected on everything that had led her to this point. She thought about the fear she had felt that night in the parking lot, the anger that followed, and the hope that had emerged from the chaos. She realized that while she had never asked to be at the center of this storm, she was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. And so, with her head held high and her heart full of purpose, Evelyn stepped into the next chapter of her journey, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The growing movement inspired by Evelyn's courage began to reshape the small town of Crestwood in ways no one could have predicted. What started as outrage over a single incident had evolved into a collective demand for justice and reform. People from all walks of life, students, parents, teachers, business owners, came together, united by a shared desire to create change. They organized protests, held community meetings, and drafted proposals aimed at holding law enforcement accountable. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope that things might actually improve. Evelyn became the face of this movement, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her story resonated deeply with so many others. She traveled to nearby towns and cities, sharing her experience and encouraging people to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Her speeches were simple, yet powerful. She didn't use fancy words or complicated arguments. Instead, she spoke from the heart, reminding audiences of their shared humanity. "We're all someone's child," she often said. "We're all deserving of respect and fairness. No one should live in fear of those who are supposed to protect us." Her message struck a chord, especially among older generations who remembered the civil rights struggles of decades past. Many saw Evelyn as a bridge between the past and present, a living reminder that the fight for equality was far from over. Younger activists admired her bravery and determination, seeing her as proof that standing up to injustice could inspire real change. Together, these diverse groups formed an unlikely alliance, working side by side to push for reforms. One of the most impactful initiatives born out of this movement was a series of town hall meetings. These gatherings provided a space for residents to voice their concerns directly to local leaders and police officials. At first, attendance was modest, but as word spread, hundreds began showing up, eager to participate. The meetings weren't always smooth. Emotions ran high, and tensions occasionally flared, but they were honest. People aired grievances they had kept bottled up for years, while others offered suggestions for how to move forward. During one particularly heated session, a young mother stood up and recounted how her teenage son had been stopped multiple times by police simply for walking home from school. Her voice trembled as she described the fear she felt every time he left the house. "I shouldn't have to worry about whether my child will make it back alive," she said, tears streaming down her face. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Moments like these humanized the issue, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss the calls for reform as mere complaints. In response to the mounting pressure, the police department announced plans to implement new policies designed to increase transparency and accountability. Body cameras would be mandatory for all officers, and footage would be reviewed regularly to ensure compliance with protocol. Additionally, independent oversight boards were established to investigate misconduct allegations without bias. While some critics argued these measures didn't go far enough, others saw them as important first steps toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Behind the scenes, however, divisions within the police force grew more pronounced. Some officers privately admitted they supported the changes, acknowledging that the system needed fixing. Others resented what they saw as interference, claiming it made their jobs harder. Conversations in the locker room turned tense, with colleagues avoiding eye contact or whispering behind closed doors. A few even considered transferring to other departments, unwilling to adapt to the shifting landscape. For the officer at the center of the controversy, life became increasingly unbearable. Once respected, or at least tolerated by his peers, he now found himself isolated. Colleagues distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings, and neighbors avoided crossing paths with him at the grocery store. Even his own family struggled to defend him publicly, though they quietly urged him to resign before things got worse. As the trial date approached, anticipation reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered daily outside the courthouse holding signs and chanting slogans. Supporters of Evelyn wore T-shirts emblazoned with messages like "Stand with her" and "Justice for all." Media trucks lined the streets, reporters eager to capture every detail of the proceedings. Inside the Yair courtroom, seats filled quickly with many arriving hours early to secure a spot. Evelyn herself remained calm amidst the chaos. She spent her days preparing for the trial, meeting with her lawyers, and reviewing evidence. Despite the stress, she refused to let anger consume her. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture, the possibility of creating lasting change. "This isn't just about me," she told a friend during a rare quiet moment. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Her optimism proved contagious. Friends and family rallied around her, offering encouragement and reassurance. Strangers sent letters and gifts, thanking her for her bravery and vowing to support the cause. One envelope contained a drawing from a child, a stick figure holding hands with a smiling sun, accompanied by the words, "You're my hero." Evelyn pinned it to her fridge, a reminder of why she had chosen to fight. The night before the trial began, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. She thought about the fear she had felt that evening in the parking lot, the shock of seeing the video go viral, and the overwhelming support she had received since then. It was surreal to think that her life had changed so drastically in such a short time. But as she looked around her cozy apartment, at the books on her shelves, the photos of loved ones on the walls, the groceries neatly stacked in the kitchen, she realized something important. None of this defined her. She was still the same person she had always been, a woman who believed in kindness, fairness, and doing what was right. With that thought, Evelyn took a deep breath and allowed herself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring challenges, questions, and perhaps even setbacks. But she was ready to face whatever came her way with grace and strength, ready to continue fighting for a world where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and valued. And so, as dawn broke over Crestwood, Evelyn stepped into the courtroom, surrounded by supporters and armed with nothing but her truth. The journey ahead would test her resolve, but she knew she wasn't alone. Together they would shine a light on injustice, and maybe, just maybe, pave the way for a brighter future. The trial began on a cloudy Monday morning, the kind of day where the sky seemed undecided, neither fully bright nor completely overcast. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered early, their voices rising in chants and songs of solidarity. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for all" and "Accountability now," while supporters hugged one another, sharing nervous energy. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras clicked softly, and murmurs filled the air as people settled into their seats. It was clear this wasn't just any legal proceeding. It was a moment that carried weight far beyond the walls of the building. Evelyn sat quietly at the front of the room, flanked by her lawyers and close family members. She looked calm, though. Anyone who knew her well could see the tension in her posture. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, but every now and then she'd rub her fingers together, a small, almost imperceptible sign of nerves. Despite everything, she carried herself with dignity. She had come here not just to seek justice for herself, but to stand up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race or background. That thought gave her strength. The prosecution opened the case with a powerful statement. They painted a vivid picture of what had happened that night in the parking lot, emphasizing how an innocent woman had been targeted simply because of the color of her skin. The prosecutor described the officer's actions as reckless, unnecessary, and rooted in prejudice. "This isn't just about one incident," they said firmly. "It's about years of unchecked behavior, a pattern of abuse that has gone unpunished for too long." Witnesses were called to testify. First came the young man who had filmed the viral video. He recounted how he had been sitting on a bench, across the street when he noticed the confrontation unfolding. "I didn't know what to do at first," he admitted. "But then I realized someone needed to document it. I thought maybe if people saw what really happened, something would finally change." His words resonated deeply with those in attendance, many of whom nodded in agreement. Next, several individuals stepped forward to share their own experiences with the officer accused of misconduct. One woman spoke about being pulled over repeatedly, under questionable circumstances, each time feeling more humiliated than the last. Another described witnessing the officer berate a neighbor during a routine traffic stop, using language that left bystanders stunned. Each story added layers to the narrative, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern. When it was Evelyn's turn to take the stand, the room fell silent. Everyone leaned forward slightly, hanging on her every word. She spoke slowly and clearly, recounting the events of that evening in detail. Her voice never wavered, even when describing the moment the gun was pointed at her chest. She explained how terrified she had been, yet also how determined she felt to remain composed. "I didn't want him to think he could break me," she said simply. "I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid." Her testimony struck a chord with everyone present. Even the judge paused briefly before moving on to cross-examination. When the defense attorney began questioning her, trying to poke holes in her account, Evelyn remained steadfast. She answered each question honestly, refusing to let frustration creep into her tone. There was a quiet power in her responses, a reminder that truth often speaks louder than doubt. The defense team worked hard to counter the prosecution's arguments. They argued that the officer had acted within protocol, claiming his actions were justified based on perceived threats. They suggested that the public outcry was fueled by misinformation and urged the jury to focus solely on the facts presented in court. Witnesses for the defense included fellow officers who vouched for the accused, describing him as professional and dedicated to his job. However, their testimonies lacked the emotional impact of those shared by the prosecution's witnesses. As the days turned into weeks, the trial became a roller coaster of emotions. Some moments brought tears, like when a mother broke down while recounting how her teenage son had been harassed by police. Others sparked anger, particularly when defense attorneys tried to discredit victims' accounts. Yet through it all, Evelyn remained a steady presence, offering comfort to those around her and staying focused on the bigger picture. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. Evelyn sat upright, gripping her daughter's hand tightly. When the foreperson stood to deliver the decision, the room grew so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," the foreperson announced, their voice echoing through the space. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly applause erupted. Tears streamed down faces, hugs were exchanged, and cheers filled the air. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, letting the relief wash over her. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered silently under similar circumstances. Outside the courthouse, celebrations spilled into the streets. Supporters danced, sang, and embraced one another, celebrating a rare victory in the fight against police misconduct. For many, the verdict represented more than accountability. It symbolized hope. Hope that systems could change, that wrongs could be righted, and that standing up for what's right could make a difference. But Evelyn knew the work wasn't done. While the guilty verdict marked a significant milestone, true reform required ongoing effort. As she addressed the crowd later that evening, she reminded them of this fact. "Today is a good day," she said, her voice strong and steady. "But tomorrow we keep fighting. We keep pushing for policies that protect everyone equally. We keep holding our leaders accountable. And most importantly, we keep believing in the power of community." Her words inspired renewed determination among those listening. Plans were already underway to continue advocating for systemic changes, including better training for officers, stricter disciplinary measures for misconduct, and increased transparency within law enforcement agencies. Evelyn vowed to stay involved, knowing her role in this movement was far from over. As the sun set on Crestwood, casting long shadows across the town square. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, people believed real progress was possible. And at the heart of it all stood Evelyn, a woman whose courage had ignited a spark, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. The verdict was a turning point, not just for Evelyn but for the entire town of Crestwood. It wasn't just about one guilty officer. It was about sending a message that no one was above accountability, especially those entrusted with protecting others. For Evelyn, the decision brought a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and even a tinge of sadness. She had never wanted to be part of such a painful story, yet here she was, standing at the center of something far bigger than herself. The days following the trial, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media frenzy died down, and reporters stopped camping outside her apartment. Protesters packed up their signs, though they promised to remain vigilant. Slowly, the spotlight shifted away from Evelyn, giving her some much-needed peace. But instead of retreating into quiet anonymity, she chose to channel her energy into something meaningful. She founded an organization dedicated to educating communities about their rights and advocating for systemic reforms in law enforcement. The nonprofit quickly gained traction, thanks in large part to Evelyn's growing reputation as a voice for justice. People from across the country reached out asking how they could start similar initiatives in their own towns. Schools invited her to speak to students about resilience and civic responsibility. Local businesses offered donations and resources eager to support her mission. What started as a small idea blossomed into a nationwide movement, all because one woman refused to stay silent. Evelyn's work wasn't easy. There were days when she felt overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what needed to be done. Police reform was a complex issue, deeply rooted in history and systemic inequalities. Changing it wouldn't happen overnight, and setbacks were inevitable. But Evelyn reminded herself, and everyone around her, that progress was built step by step. Even small victories mattered, whether it was convincing a single person to speak up or helping draft a new policy proposal. Each effort contributed to the larger goal. Back in Crestwood, the police department worked hard to rebuild trust with the community. Body cameras became mandatory, and footage was reviewed regularly to ensure transparency. Independent oversight boards held monthly meetings, inviting residents to share concerns and suggestions. Officers participated in de-escalation training programs designed to teach them how to handle tense situations without resorting to force. Some officers embraced these changes, recognizing them as necessary steps toward improvement. Others resisted, grumbling about unnecessary bureaucracy. Still, the overall tone within the department shifted, slowly but surely. One evening, during a community meeting, a young officer stood up and addressed the crowd. He admitted he had been skeptical about the reforms at first, believing they would make his job harder. But after attending training sessions and listening to residents' stories, he realized the changes weren't about punishing police. They were about creating a safer environment for everyone. "We're supposed to protect and serve," he said earnestly. "And sometimes that means holding ourselves accountable too." His words earned applause, signaling a shift in perspective among both law enforcement and civilians. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings, and lingering mistrust, but the foundation for change had been laid. For Evelyn, seeing this transformation unfold gave her hope. She knew there was still work to be done, but she also saw glimpses of a brighter future. One day, while visiting a local school to talk to students, she met a little girl who handed her a drawing. The picture showed a smiling figure surrounded by people holding hands under a rainbow. At the bottom, the child had written, "Thank you for making the world better." Evelyn smiled, her eyes misting over. She knelt down and hugged the girl, tightly. "You're welcome," she whispered. "But remember, we all have a role to play in making the world better. Never forget that." As months turned into years, Evelyn continued to inspire others. Her nonprofit grew, expanding its reach to cities and towns nationwide. She traveled often, sharing her story and encouraging people to stand up against injustice. Yet despite her busy schedule, she always made time for her family and friends, cherishing the simple joys of life. A warm cup of tea, laughter shared over dinner, walks through the park on crisp autumn mornings, reflecting on everything that had happened. Evelyn realized she had grown in ways she never expected. The incident that once filled her with fear had transformed her into a symbol of strength and resilience. She had faced hatred head-on and emerged stronger, proving that courage could ignite change. And though scars remained from that fateful night, they served as reminders of how far she and her community had come. One evening, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn thought about the journey she had been on. From the quiet streets of Crestwork to the national stage, she had walked a path she never imagined. But she knew none of it would have been possible without the countless individuals who had supported her along the way. The neighbors who rallied behind her, the activists who amplified her voice, the strangers who sent messages of encouragement. Together they had created a wave of change that rippled far beyond one small town. Her thoughts drifted to the future. What challenges lay ahead? What battles still needed to be fought? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing, for certain. As long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, progress would continue. Justice might take time, but it was worth fighting for. The cicadas chirped softly in the distance, their song blending with the gentle hum of the evening breeze. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way she planned, but perhaps that was okay. Sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most meaningful destinations. And so, with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken, Evelyn looked toward tomorrow, ready to face whatever came next. Because now, more than ever, she believed that even in the darkest moments light could shine through, and together they could build a world where everyone felt safe, valued, and free.